Epistle and Verse. Before I got into the meat of today's video, I wanted to make a quick PSA. For those who don't know, a volcano, La Soufriere, recently erupted in St Vincent. It spewed a lot of volcanic ash, on the ashes spreading to other islands in the Caribbean. So I am going to include a link in the description box for this video of a thread that someone on Twitter made of like different organizations that are setting up donations of like supplies to send to people, places that are taking, donation money, helping with relief efforts. And, I would encourage you to help if you're able, or retweet the threads with information on the eruption. Hey, editing Chloe here. Just want to say that it has been a few weeks since the initial eruptions of La Soufriere, but I checked on some of the GoFundMes and it looks like they're still open. It's really only been 2 weeks. I imagine that there's still going to be a lot of after effects to deal with. So I think, helping as possible is still, going to be useful. So now that I've given my PSA, the main reason I am filming today's video is because April is National Poetry Month in the US. I'm going to talk about 3 speculative poetry collections that I read and enjoyed that I think are good for people who are new to poetry, for people who are new to speculative poetry that might get you interested in checking out more. So for those who don't know, speculative fiction is basically any fiction not set in the world as we know it. So this encompasses science fiction, it encompasses fantasy, it encompasses some horror that has like supernatural or paranormal elements to it. Speculative poetry is poetry on similar themes. There is an association for speculative poetry. It's called the Science Fiction Poetry Association. Speculative fiction is a kind of nebulous term, like what does the world as we know it really mean? World as we know it for me, an atheist, is probably different for world as we know it for someone who practices IFA, so on and so forth. I think that just kind of is the nature of genres in general. They seem straightforward at first if you don't go too into it, but if you look at it, there's always like this fuzzy area around the edges. So I mentioned earlier that I don't really read a whole lot of poetry. I didn't really get into poetry. And so I thought it'd also be interesting to talk about my journey into finally deciding to pick it up. I, like a lot of people, didn't have a great experience with poetry in school. Like, I'm not someone who's really like resents having to look for themes in a piece of art, but I think it's also like kind of frustrating because like for the stuff I'm reading now, I'm just very familiar with the context, so I'm just like, oh, like obviously this connects to this. But the poetry that I was reading in high school, I didn't really know a whole lot about the historical context, and also I was just like, I was under 18. Like some things don't really mean a whole lot to you until you have like experienced it for yourself. So I read poetry in school, but I wasn't super into it. I wasn't really gonna read it on my own. I wasn't looking for it in my spare time. But that changed because of a singular poetry collection that I'm going to talk about more in this video. That is Libra Season by Soufriere. That is a moniker that the author uses because of the subject matter of their writing. And I think I was just in a space where like a lot of the things that they were talking about just like really hit home. And I really connected to it and I really liked it. And that was the first poetry collection I had read about speculative things. And that's kind of like what opened me up to the idea of reading poetry. I think something that also, which was very recent, was that when I was going through the poetry collections, I was having issues like just concentrating and like taking stuff in. I mentioned this a little in the nonfiction live, but I do tend to skim things when I read, which isn't great, but like it is what it is. And obviously like a poem isn't very long, so I'd get through it and I'd basically skimmed it, and so I didn't get anything out of it because poetry requires like such a focus on like the lines and the details and stuff. And so I started reading it aloud, which helped a lot. It really helped me focus in on the poetry and think about what was actually going on as I was reading it and like the emotion and stuff behind it that just kind of like naturally came as I was reading the words. Poetry obviously is also a focus on form and sound. And reading aloud, I was really like I could feel like this, how the syllables felt, and like really enjoy like some words are just fun to say. Like I like saying the word ache. I don't know, I like that like sound at the end of the word, and it feels good to say. So that's kind of how I got more into poetry. I'm definitely a lot more open to reading poetry and speculative poetry in particular after kind of finding out what drew me into it. Also, I don't know if people would expect this based on my videos, but like I do have an ego. And so something about having like this thing in front of me to perform and being like, oh, I'm killing it. Like I'm just embodying this poem. Like something about that, like just being more active with it and like basically it made me feel real cool. That got me a lot more into it. So now that all that preface is out of the way, let's talk about some speculative poetry collections. So first one up is the one I kind of mentioned already, which is Libra Season by Soufriere. This one is not all speculative poetry. I'd say about a third of it is speculative poetry. But the stuff that was in there I did really, really like. And like I said, it was kind of what got me into wanting to read poetry. So I wanted to include it in this video. In terms of content warnings, there are poems about verbal abuse and there is some sexually explicit content in here. Just in general, I just love how this book looks. Like I love the cover. I like a lot of the font choices and formatting inside the book. Like it has like, I don't know what the font type is, but it's like very grand looking font, very fancy. In terms of like the topics that are discussed in here, there's stuff about being a stripper, there's stuff about being a young sapphic, realizing your sexuality, and just like what it means to understand your sexuality as a young person. There's a lot of like erotic elements in here and like discussions of romantic relationships. So I really enjoyed the blending of fantasy imagery and Av. Av is African American Vernacular English. This was before I was reading a lot of fantasy by Black authors, and like even now that I'm reading it, I don't see a whole lot of fantasy books that use Av. Now I know that, you know, Wings of Ebony by Elle does it, and Stone and Steel by Ebony J. Dunbar, and Sorcerer of the Wildeeps by Ashante Wilson. So in terms of like what fantasy elements are there are witches, there are dragons, there are merfolk, and there is a reimagining of the biblical Genesis story. My personal favorite poems from the collection are Epiphany, Cult of Unbotheredness, Becoming the Dragon's Daughter, and A Date and a Dragon. Epiphany is one of the opening poems. It's about the narrator first becoming a stripper. Cult of Unbotheredness is generally about feeling the need to pretend like you're above everything and you're unfazable. I still don't really know what Becoming the Dragon's Daughter is about, but it's one with like a lot of the fantasy imagery. Well, A Date and a Dragon is about a dragon who's dating a witch and realizing that they're not compatible and wondering why they're not compatible. And Resting Bitch Face was a really good poem from this collection. It's not my favorite just because of the subject matter. Like it's about verbal abuse from a parent, and it reads like a stream of consciousness, like you getting chewed out by this parent. It was a great poem, very well structured and executed, I thought, but like, yeah, I would just feel weird saying like, oh, this is like a favorite. Like this is one that like I would dread rereading just because, you know, you are there. I mean, obviously poetry has very vivid imagery, but I did just love the range of it. I love the defiant tone, this idea of like talking back to people who don't understand you or are purposely misunderstanding you or who have abandoned you. I felt like even in the poems that weren't quite what I might consider speculative, there was like this focus on like jewel tones and like metals and like things that have like a comforting weight to them that I really enjoyed. So Libra Season, I think you can only buy it through Amazon. The author self-published it, and if you go to the site and try to buy it from there, it's just going to redirect you to Amazon. Next poetry collection is Manifest by Thérèse Mason-Pierre. I don't remember how I first heard of Thérèse Mason-Pierre. I think that she is a co-editor of Augur magazine, which is a speculative fiction literary magazine based in Canada. I believe the focus is on publishing Indigenous speculative fiction authors. Truthfully, I had heard of this. I was like, this seems cool. This cover looks beautiful. And it was languishing on my to-buy shelf. And then in Jerry of Onyx Pages did an interview with the author. And that really like lit the fire under me to, you know, press the buy button after the item was in my cart. Of the books I'm going to talk about, this is the one with the most speculative elements. Every single poem in this collection is pretty explicitly speculative. There are aliens, there are various apocalypses and dystopias, there's space travel, ghosts, La Diablesse, there's a poem with a mermaid. Many of the poems are about Black people in alternate worlds. There's a couple poems in here thinking about like the history of the Caribbean and like reconciling with that history. Another common theme is using speculative elements to talk about family connections, especially between parent and child. Also, a lot of the poems are about longing, whether that's longing for a person or for a relationship or for a certain type of life. And I think the tone overall is more meditative. So I really enjoyed pretty much all the poems in here, but my two favorite poems were Violet and Manifest. Manifest is the titular poem, and I thought that was a pretty fair designation. Violet is told from this perspective of a person who lives on a planet where organic life doesn't really exist anymore. Like, people are around, but plant life, stuff like that, isn't really there. And it's about them reading about the planets that used to exist. And Manifest is about someone's journey to a foreign planet and the life and the freedom that they find there. Manifest by Tresemme St Pierre was published by Gap Riot Press. I will include the link to the press in the description box below. And then last up is Consumed, Reduced to Beautiful Grey Ashes by Linda D. Addison. For those who don't know, Linda D. Addison is a horror poet. She was the first African American to win a Stoker Award, which is the main horror award in the English-speaking part of the world. This collection was her first book to win a Stoker, so it just seemed significant, so I decided to read it. This is from Space and Time Books. I will include a buy link in the description box below for those interested. In terms of content warnings, there is domestic abuse. It has an intro by Charlie Jacob, and Charlie Jacob talks a bit about the collection. It isn't strictly speculative, but there is a common thread throughout the poems examining like the horrific and obscene aspects of humanity. And it's illustrated, which was another draw for me. It has black and white like ink illustrations by Marge Simon. One of my favorite like poem illustration combo was about bottle trees. So, I'm a sucker for books with illustrations in them. There's a common thread throughout the books about dealing with romantic or sexual relationships and the unhealthy possessiveness that can occur there, whether it's from the perspective of the perpetrator or being on the receiving end of that. There's also like themes in here about mourning, whether that be a death or whether it be sort of like the things you gave up because of the decisions that you made. There's kind of a mix of tones, but I was definitely drawn to the ones that were like passionate, the ones that were dramatic, ones that had like a fire to them. My favorite poems were Have We Met Before, which you could argue isn't speculative, but as I interpret it, it's about a time slip. I also enjoyed Avenging Dream, which is a very dramatic vow for vengeance. And then I also enjoyed Fiery Oracle, which is a poem about like clarity that comes when you lose certain things. In terms of the fantastical elements in this collection, there are dragons, there are zombies, there are bottle trees, there are assorted like nebulous, not really named supernatural forces that are like malevolent. So that's the video. Do you have any speculative poetry collections to recommend? Are there any that you think you'll check out or that particularly speak to you? Thanks for watching. Have a good one. Goodbye.